right, hi everybody. What a beautiful spring New England day. We all get to convene together. I just want to first say thank you for having me. I've heard so much about the work that gets done in spaces like this with Fix the Grid and Slingshot. And I also, on a personal note, I want to thank Mireille, who has been like a really unbelievable teacher for me on a whole bunch of complicated issues to help me understand the grid better. And so it's a very special experience to be able to come up here and try to offer some ideas, strategies to help you do this work at the local level and statewide and regionally. And so my background, I run a communications firm called 90 West. We do message development, media relations, crisis communications, advocacy communications, all kinds of fun stuff. And about 80% of our work is in the climate and clean energy space. It really is our focus. And we have a whole bunch of different projects kind of across the board: environmental justice issues, resilience, clean energy. And it's been really, really exciting over the last couple of years to really dig deep and start to wrestle with these questions of how do we take oftentimes really complicated technical stuff and make it accessible to people to bring them along with us as a part of our movements. My background is I spent about a decade of my life with the former governor of Massachusetts, Deval Patrick. I was his press secretary and spokesman for many years. I learned a lot during those times about things we did wrong on clean energy transition, and so it's been really exciting for me to be back in the work now when a lot of the things that we couldn't do back then are now within reach. And I spend most of my day talking to reporters, pitching stories, and trying to get them excited about the stuff that we're excited about. And so yeah, today what I'm gonna do is I want to start by giving you some strategies and sort of really like a model you can follow, whether you're doing a local effort or a regional effort as a part of a big movement or in your neighborhood, some really practical steps to approach communication strategies, right? And to actually give you like tactical stuff to operationalize this work. And then I'll give you an example of a project I was actually involved on with Mireille that just to kind of show what it looks like in motion. And then at the end, with the time we have left, I would love to have everybody try it on for size and actually do a little bit of generative workshopping on some of these messages as well. Sound good? Excited? Okay. By the way, I tend to like get very excited and my hands start flying and everything. If you want to jump in, just shoot your hand up or shout something. I'll stop. I want to make sure if you have questions, if there's things you want to challenge, things you want to explore more, that we do that. Okay? All right. So, first slide. Okay, so this model that I'm about to walk you through has been like my guiding light in doing communications work for 2 decades. This is like, I always, when I'm doing media trainings, when I'm building really complicated communication plans, this is the beating heart of really good communications work. This is what I believe is like the central tenets of doing persuasive communications. And it actually is gonna seem intuitive, but it's harder to put into motion, so we're gonna do that next. But the first thing is this notion that there are really 3 things we have to think about before we go out and we start doing the communications work of trying to persuade people, whether it's a piece of policy we're trying to advance, whether we're trying to recruit volunteers to show up somewhere, whether we're trying to mobilize for building capacity of our organizations. This is the process. The first question that we have to ask ourselves is, who are we actually talking to, as specifically as we can? Then we ask ourselves, what do those people need to hear from us? And then the last part, once we are really clear who our audience is and what they need to hear from us, then we can do the tactical part, which is what are the right vehicles to deliver our really, really amazing message we've developed to our audience. And that's the order. I think one of the things I've learned over the years is there's a tendency sometimes to go right to the tactics. Like we just want to get out there and we want to start doing stuff, right? And I get it and I'm with you. But everything we do on the front end to get audience and message right will have a much higher efficiency when we go to the tactical part at the end. And so I'm going to unpack for you a little bit about what that looks like. So when we talk about audience, here's the questions I ask myself when I'm beginning a persuasion campaign. I am trying to persuade somebody of something or a group of people of something, whether it's the Department of Public Utilities or the legislature or whomever. The first thing is to be as specific as possible. Who are we actually trying to talk to, right? I have done communications plans before that are literally directed at the board of ISO New England. We're actually going to talk about that in a second. I'm going to show you an example of that. I've built communications plans that are just directed at a Department of Public Utilities commissioner, right? The more specific that we can be about where the levers of power are and who needs to hear from us, we can be a lot more thoughtful when we build our message. Because there is a tendency, and I'm sure you've all been there, that we like to say things like, our audience is the general public. Yes, it is, but I don't know how your organizations work. The ones that I'm involved in, we do not have the bandwidth or the capacity to talk to every single person in the state about the issues we care about. And so to protect our own mental health and our precious time, we have to think about prioritization and doing it in terms of really specific audiences. So I actually, when I start this process, I will literally push our organizations we work with. I want you to, on a board, put up a list. You're going to tell me what your objective is. I want to pass this bill. I want to change this regulation. I want to get this company out of here. Whatever it is. Within that objective, who are the most important audiences who have power to make that change? And we're going to list them by priority. And then we're going to look at our internal bandwidth. And we're going to say, who can we actually really reach and how, right? Just being honest about the way of the world and how much time we have. Then we get to do the really fun part. We can look at those audience and say, all right, let's start to understand how they make decisions, right? What keeps them up at night? What do they worry about? When they see this, they do this. What are the things that inspire them? What are the things that make them say, okay, I want to be a part of this. I don't want to be behind the, chasing this. I want to be in front. I want to be included. And also ask ourselves, where do they get their information? Right? I think a lot of time when we're building communication strategies, we do a lot of conventional work where we go to this newspaper or that newspaper, and that may be the right place. But first we have to ask ourselves, does our audience get trusted information from the places that we think they do? Right? Because then we can build outreach strategies and media strategies or anything else that we know will connect and be credible with them. With me so far? Sound good? Okay. Next slide. Okay, so once we've really been clear on audience, we've built those priorities, we can move to the messaging piece. And throughout my entire career, there's been one really strong constant, which is that the best, most persuasive communications, I believe, comes at this nexus between emotion and credibility, right? We have to find ways to make even the most complicated issues emotional and emotionally resonant, right? Not because we want to manipulate people, but because human beings are emotional people. We make decisions not just based on pure, rationality. We do it because it means something to us, right? I tell when I do media trainings, I do a lot of trainings to teach. I was Congresswoman Presley's spokesman for her campaign in 2018, and I did lots of media trainings with her. And one of the things I always did in the media trainings was to remind that even journalists who are very objective in their job of trying to cover things are emotional people. They want to tell emotional stories. And what that means is that we have to find a way to make even the complicated emotional. I will tell you how I do that in a moment, because I think it's something that all of you are doing on a regular basis. You may just need some strategies to capture it. On the flip side, though, we can't just do raw emotion, right? And by the way, I want to just tell you, because I want to make sure you know that I'm putting action behind my words. I have found ways to make things like reverse osmosis water desalination emotional, right? I was working on a project on reverse osmosis water desalination. How many people here know what that is, by the way? But of course in this room people know what reverse osmosis. So anyway, I didn't. And I said, okay, how do I make that? They really wanted CNN to do a story about the importance of reverse osmosis water desalination for the world. And I was like, okay, yes, very straightforward. You call up CNN and you say, you got to cover reverse osmosis. You get hung up on very, very quickly. But what we did was we said, all right, what would make CNN interested in science? What if we took a whole bunch of polluted, dirty water and put it through a reverse osmosis water desalination system, and then somebody drank it, right? Now it's an emotional story of like, oh, that's interesting. Now that like I drink water, I do things, that's okay, I get it, right? And then we got to unpack the science, right? And I don't want it to sound cynical. It's just the reality of how I think people take in information. But we can't just do emotion. We have to balance it with credibility. And when I say credibility, this is the substance of the policy. This is the complicated meat and potatoes stuff that we also have to include. This is where your really key data points that you always refer to when you're talking about a certain issue, that becomes a really important part of your inventory, right? This is where the case studies of specific projects or things that bring this to light, that is credibility building. This is where the reports and the analyses and the 500-page, pitched a story to the Boston Globe a couple years ago about the energy efficiency 3-year planning process. Not the most exciting topic to pitch a columnist who never writes about energy, right? But she wrote a full column about this. This is Yvonne Abraham from the Boston Globe. Full column based on a 75-page participation report that I don't even know if she read past the 3rd or 4th page, but we found a way to take the data points and then connect her with an emotional story of real people, and she was willing to write that story, right? And that's what gets to this last piece, which is if you take all that emotion of really closing your eyes and thinking, where is my heart on this issue? Who do I think of when I close my eyes and think about this issue? The people that matter the most, who are most impacted. And then we merge that with credibility. What we get, more often than not, is real stories of real people, right? We get out of abstract policy and we get into the lived experiences of real people and telling stories about communities, right? And so these types of stories, I think, are the bread and butter of doing this kind of storytelling right. I think very often we get stuck in abstract policy language. Another way to think about that is we get stuck in talking points, and we have to bring it down to ground level so that if I'm talking to you and I'm trying to get you excited about this issue, that you can actually imagine something in your head while I'm talking to you. You're gonna see a face, or you're gonna see a community. Tomorrow there's gonna be a column in the Boston Globe about offshore wind. This is an issue I've been working on for a bunch of years. And rather than pitch an abstract story about what the community in Salem is doing, environmental justice advocates are doing to make sure that their community is not hit with new burdens from a new industry, rather than having the city be the only narrator or the legislators and the mayor be the narrator, we have the community narrating a story. I hope it's going to be as good as I think it is. That is literally about a very specific community stepping up and being part of that. And that's what made the story real, and it's what takes it out of the abstract. And then, I would think about, actually you could stay on the slide, I would think about these things as you're doing this work, as you're doing an inventory. What are the emotions we want to convey? What do we want our audience to feel when they interact with our communications? And what is our inventory of credibility? What are the data points? What are the stories? What are the different communities that we want to help people understand and be able to see when we talk about it? Then I do think we also need to give ourselves a little bit of a script on how we talk about this stuff. So if you go to the next slide. Okay, so I have found that one of the things that I struggle with the most when I'm doing communications work is I know all the stuff, I've got all the things that I want to say. But how do I actually structure them in a way that it makes it accessible for the people who are hearing it? And this is what I'm showing you here is one of my absolute favorite structures for doing persuasive messaging. which is that we lead and open with explaining to people what is the problem that we've identified that we are trying to solve. Then we move to the solution that we are providing to fix that problem, or that we recommend that policymakers or others undertake to fix the problem. And then we finish with a call to action and leave people with, and if you agree with us that this problem is real and that the solution we're offering is a good one, I need you to do the call to action, right? I have found that if this is inverted or in different orders, it actually makes it a lot more complicated, because if I start talking about the solution to a really complicated problem with somebody before convincing them that we have a problem, they're kind of like, okay, that all sounds great, but like, why are we talking about this? Like, why is this such a big deal? I love to lead with the problem to get people on the same page as me, and then I can do the solution. Yeah?
What's the difference between supporting and validating data points?
Yes. So there's actually no real difference. It's actually, that's actually funny. I don't know why it shows up like that. But this is, I did want to get to these supporting pieces, which is all that stuff in that emotion and credibility inventory gets assigned a job, right? So the data point that you have that really shows how bad the problem is from a report or an analysis, that gets assigned under the problem, right? And we're going to use it there. The story that you have of a community or a person or a family that is sort of the ones impacted by the issue, that can be in the problem, most likely. Or if it's a community, say, that found a solution to the problem and did it right and fixed the problem, they can be assigned under the solution, right? So we take all of our stuff and we give it a job. We assign it to one of these buckets, and now we have a roadmap when we're doing that elevator pitch, right? Because oftentimes, right, our communications, we don't have the luxury of having a captive audience for an hour to listen to us talk without interruption about the issues we care about. It may be you've got 7 minutes, 15 minutes at an event where you've pulled somebody aside, or you're given a chance to speak for a few minutes at a much larger event or effort or something like that. Or my favorite, you catch a legislator or a policymaker in the hallway of an important building, important government building, and you literally say to them, boom, boom, boom. This will give you a roadmap to start to do that. Now, I want to be clear, I don't want to be prescriptive. There are other ways to do this, to organize these things, but I will tell you one thing, I love my messaging in threes. This is going to sound really silly, but like my entire life of doing this work, I have found that having 3 thematic messages that are the 3 things that we have to get across. Another way to think of this is if I have someone's attention for 30 minutes or 15 minutes, that at the end of the conversation, they will say back to me, this conversation was about 1, 2, and 3, right? The reason I like that is that if we get more complicated than 3, it can get very diluted, right? We have so much stuff we're throwing at people that it overwhelms. And if it's so simplistic that we just have one message and one message only, without being able to kind of tell a story with a problem, a solution, and a call to action, I do find that it tends to be almost too simplified, right? We want it to be substantive, but also something we can deliver in a really short time period. And so that's why I really like this roadmap, and I think it's something that I found people can start to operationalize pretty quickly. Any questions about this? Make sense? Seem reasonable? Something accessible? Okay. So then I did want to do this last part, which is we talked about audience, being really specific on audience. We talked about how we could build a message. And then comes this question of what are the actual vehicles I have to deliver message to audience? So shout a few things out. What vehicles do you all use currently to deliver message to your audiences? TikTok, right off the bat, starting with TikTok. Is it Newsletters. Speaking at events and gesticulating with your hands, and what else? Letters to the editor, yes. What else? WhatsApp, love it. Keep going. Email blasts, yep, everyone's cultivating good email lists. Yes, absolutely. Yes, love it. The question to ask ourselves when we are trying to put our communications work into motion is, what is the total universe of vehicles I have in order to deliver message, right? It very well may be, by the way, that oftentimes the most effective and efficient way to deliver message is this old thing called grassroots organizing, right? Looking people in the eye and having a conversation in their doorway, right? I'm a grassroots organizer. That was my first ever job in politics. I learned more about how to communicate persuasively having doors slammed in my face across Massachusetts and trying to talk to people for 7 minutes before they slam that door, right, to keep the door open than I ever did working with reporters and all this other fancy stuff, right? Grassroots organizing is amazing because it is both effective and sometimes efficient if you can find ways to do it at scale with lots of wonderful people. The other tools that we have, though, right? Yes, we have the media. We have all the lists that we build on our own. We have our websites and blogs and things like that. But I think the really question to ask before we put this in motion is, how much bandwidth do we have, and what will be most effective and most efficient within that bandwidth to hit the folks that we really, really need to hit as our core audience? By the way, one of my favorite things to do is to give people permission that if social media is actually not a helpful thing for you, you don't have to do it, right? If you would rather spend 30 minutes going door to door to 5 houses in your neighborhood and get 2 of those people to come to the next organizing meeting than spending your day blasting out tweets for 4 hours that go into the middle of nowhere and we don't know if anyone's responding to them other than really angry people who yell, maybe it's not a good use of your time to be on X, right? On the flip side, maybe that is the place you have to be, right? Maybe that is where your audience is. My only point to you is ask yourself the question, right? Which vehicle is the one I actually need, or vehicles, to get this out? Questions on that? Great. Okay, so now I'm going to give you just a little bit of a tool for that elevator conversation, right? So you have your audience priority, the person you've said is one of the people I really need to convince, is standing right in front of you, right? And you've got their attention, and we're not sure for how long, okay? We said over here, we're going to lead with the problem we're solving, our solution to the problem, and our call to action to move a solution forward. By the way, these things next to those words are islands. That's a palm tree on an island, because this is our happy place. I want you to think about it as your messaging happy place. You know what it feels like, right? You're in a conversation, maybe it's a little antagonistic, and you're hitting all your points, and you're nailing your messaging. That feels really good, right? We want to be on our happy place as much as possible. We want to be sitting on our islands, drinking our favorite beverage in the sun. But we also acknowledge that most conversations aren't as simple as, so tell me all the amazing things I need to know about the work that you're doing. If somebody asks you that question, I beg of you, let your answer be, oh, thank you so much for asking me that. The problem I'm solving is this. The solution to the problem is this. And my call to action for you, neighbor, is this, right? That's what I want you to do. That's a layup. That's as easy as it gets. But more often it's, I heard this about this. Is that true, right? That's like the first question you get is like, we're going down a rabbit hole, right? And we're already like, okay, how do I get myself grounded? This is like a little formula. It looks more scientific than it really is, which is just to say to you that we always want to make sure that we're answering people's questions to the best of our ability, right? The politicians who I do media trainings with really don't like this part, right? This is where I tell them, like, you need to not be dismissive of people, right? You need to make a good, valiant effort to try to engage. By the way, I have a separate training I do for dealing with people who have no interest ever in working with us and all they want to do is hurt us. I would just tell you to move on to the next conversation. But for today, the premise is we're talking to someone who is persuadable, right? That whatever the questions we're given, we're going to give a 20% shot at answering that question. We're going to spend 20% of our time answering the question. But then what we're going to do is something I call a bridge phrase, which is we're going to move the discussion to our terms by saying something like, you know, so we get this question, we go down the rabbit hole. Oh, that's a really interesting question. My understanding of that issue is such and such. But what I'm really focused on right now, the issue that is keeping me up at night, is this one. And here's why that's a big problem, by the way. And if you're curious, here's my solution to that problem. And by now, you're probably pretty interested in it. Here's the call to action to do something about it, right? Or I sometimes just say, I used to do a lot of, played a pundit on television, doing, they had me on to debate Republicans about things because I was like a Democratic operative, and I really didn't like it very much. But I would be on live television, and people would be saying like really wild things to me. And I found that one of the easiest ways to get people to stop interrupting me and stop being antagonistic was to say, that's a really interesting point you just made. I don't really agree, and here's why. But you know what's really important to me, what my values are, what matters most to me, when I put my daughter to bed at night, and I'm thinking about the kind of future she is going to grow up in. I have a 9-month-old, so I'm obsessed with using examples about my daughter. That makes people stop and listen, right? We get to bring the conversation back to our terms. What this is really for, this type of structure, is for the reality, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, you have an opportunity to do messaging with someone that really matters. And all of a sudden you get to the end of the conversation and you're like, oh my God, I've been talking to this person for 27 minutes and I have not gone into any of the stuff I really needed to cover, and now I'm gonna try to fit as much of it as possible in at the very end. And so we throw everything at them, but wait, before you go, I just wanted to tell you that here's the problem I'm solving, here's the solution to the problem, and here's a call to action, right? It's not gonna stick the same way. What we have to do is always find ways, and by the way, I use this a lot with reporters, and many of you may be talking to journalists, so it works very well in that context, but it works more broadly in any grassroots organizing or stakeholder policy engagement conversation, which is oftentimes the people that we're talking to will start with a really specific question, right? They have something in mind about the issue that we're talking about, and they want to know an answer to their question right away. What I usually do in those situations is I'll say, that's a great question, I'm going to answer that in a second, but can I just take a step back and just help you understand where I'm coming from on this issue? Can I zoom out for a moment and let you know where my heart is on this? I get to do problem, solution, call to action first, and then I can actually come back and say, okay, did it once, I've anchored the conversation. Now I can say, all right, on that issue though that you just raised, it's a really important question. Here's my, my best shot at answering it. I think that I want to make sure I'm caught up here. We had a really, well, actually, let me stop. Are there any questions on this? Does this feel like something that's doable? And I think what I would say on that note is that this takes practice, right? I have been practicing this my entire life. And I'm not going to be dramatic here, and this is not just trying to be exciting for the backdrop of a presentation. When I have a major conversation I'm doing with a key stakeholder on an issue, or if I'm about to talk to a journalist on the record, or I'm prepping a principal, an elected official to talk to somebody on the record, then I am actually going to put them through this process. What are our 3 messages? Do they fit into a problem solution call to action? If so, great. And then I'm not just going to do a mistake that I think oftentimes we make, which is I'm not going to prepare with an abstract philosophical discussion of what we need to convey, right? So I've been in group settings where we're about to go into a big meeting with a legislator who's really key on an issue. And we say so we sit in a room and we look around the circle and everyone goes around and says, I think we need to say this. And I think we need to say this. And I think we need to say this. That's great. But then let's practice saying it. The role playing of talking to people in high stakes, important conversations will do so much difference for you than talking about it in the abstract, right? So a great exercise maybe for a future summit, right, is where you actually have to role play having a conversation about the grid with somebody who is a really important stakeholder or your neighbor, right? And you actually role play that out because it's going to feel, anyone want to guess which word I'm going to use? How it's going to feel doing a role play about that? Although maybe not for this group, you're all pretty used to this. It usually feels awkward, right? To sit and have that conversation and hear yourself talk about the issue as if you're really doing it, right? I do not allow our clients who we work with on these issues to talk to reporters on any topic until they've done a role play with us not where we have an abstract conversation, but we actually do the conversation, you know, we experience what that's like. Yes?
Looking at this slide and realizing I'm hearing this, especially from a politician, but from Pittsburgh or something. I've seen it many times, and when I hear it or see it, it sounds inauthentic. It's, oh, they're taking my question, ignoring it, and going to theirs.
Yes.
And they do that all the time.
Yep.
And I don't like them doing that all the time.
It's a great question. So here's the difference, I believe. I am not saying 0, 100, right? I am actually saying that you should give as much time as you want to, and it doesn't have to be 20. You could do 30, 70, or you could do 40, 60. But we're going to do the work up front to be able to answer the hard questions. We're not going to evade them. But what we're going to do is say, I don't know if I'm going to have time or get the question that allows me to talk about what I'm here to talk about, and I have to say it, right? Like, I got 30 minutes with this person. I need them to hear it from me. And if I'm just waiting for them to give me that layup question, like, tell me what you really care about, or tell me what issues matter to you, there's no guarantee I'm going to get it. And so this is just a strategy to say we always do answer every question that we can to the best of our abilities, but then we give ourselves a way to include what we're there to talk about. The really evasive politician stuff is so inauthentic. You're 100% right? But what the politicians do is they're like boxers, like bobbing and weaving, and they're doing 1% answer the question and 99% pivot to something else, right? And what I'm saying is, we're going to do as much as we need to answer the question for that credibility and authenticity, but then we're just not going to lose the opportunity to also say what we came to say, right? Does that make sense? Great. I thought I'd give you, how am I doing on time? We're good. Okay, great. This is just a little fun case study on an issue that I know matters to many of you, on ISO New England. So this is an example of a project where we actually built a communications plan based on a lot of the substance of this model, right, of doing it this way. And if you go to the next slide, so our objective was, there was, up in Burlington, Vermont, there was a FERC meeting, FERC, FERC meeting. Everyone know FERC? Reasonably, sort of? Okay. Federal agency, yeah, okay. Federal regulatory group. And we saw an opportunity at a summit that was going to be focused on grid reliability for New England to show up and make some noise in the media about the talking points that the grid operators, ISO New England, were using, saying that we needed more gas, more gas, more gas to have a reliable grid, right? This was, how long ago was this? Like, I don't know, 2 years? It feels like a decade ago, but I think it was about 2 years ago. It was a year ago in the fall, maybe. So yeah, a year and a half ago. And this is at the time, the grid operator was in every venue possible saying, when the winter comes, we're just gonna need more gas, more gas. We need more gas on our system forever, because if we don't have it, when the winter comes, the lights are gonna go out, basically. And so we said, how do we crash the party? We knew that this was gonna be a setting where they were gonna be given a microphone to make this commentary over and over and over again, and we wanted to participate. Yeah?
Who exactly is the we?
Yes. Yeah, so the we was a group of 4 or 5 organizations who care about this. So it was Slingshot, it was Conservation Law Foundation, it was the Northeast Clean Energy Council, and Acadia Center. Yeah, so it was a group of about 3 or 4 organizations that wanted to make some noise. It wasn't an official coalition. It was just a group of experts that said, this group, the ISO New England should not get to do this without having to answer these questions, right? And we knew the journalists were going to be there. We knew there was a lot of reporters that were likely to cover it. And so we wanted to take the opportunity to both set the record straight on a messaging perspective, but also to apply pressure on them to abandon that messaging and that strategy. And so we did our audience assessment. We said, who's going to be there? Well, we know there's going to be officials there from FERC. We know that there's going to be elected officials and policymakers there. We know that the people who actually work for ISO New England, their board members, their leadership, were going to be there. So this is like, you get a captive audience in a hotel ballroom. It's a really good venue to do communications work. And we knew that there were going to be journalists. So those were our priorities. Those are the people that we really wanted to make sure we could have an impact with. And I won't go into each of the messages, but we built them out in the framework, right? The problem we're solving, the solution to the problem, and the call to action. And each organization, by the way, I said this was like, it wasn't a coalition. It was just a group of organizations who cared about the issue. They all had their own version of this, right? It didn't have to be perfectly exactly the same, but thematically, this was what we were trying to convey. Here's what we think the problem is, here's what we think the solution is, and here's what we see as a call to action. We developed a series of tactics where we thought we could get some volume for our side of the story. We wanted to do some op-eds, and I heard letters to the editor mentioned as a vehicle. Op-eds are just longer letters to the editor in many ways. By the way, I do a whole training on how to write an op-ed, so we can do that sometime. We held a virtual media briefing. I think we did it 3 days before the summit, where we invited every journalist who we thought would show up at the summit to get on a Zoom with our experts and just hear from us about what we had to say, right? It wasn't a really intense, like hard-hitting conversation. It was, hey, we have a bunch of experts who really know this issue well. Come on a Zoom with us for an hour and let's talk about the grid. And we used this as an opportunity to talk to the people who we knew were going to cover it. And specifically, we really wanted to get something into the Burlington Free Press. Anybody want to guess why? We're talking about vehicles here. Why might the Burlington Free Press be important? The summit was in Burlington, and my understanding was that everyone at the hotel got the newspaper delivered to their door on the morning of if you were staying at the hotel, and these folks were probably traveling in many cases. So I said, I would love if the FERT commissioners woke up and before they went down to breakfast saw a story in the newspaper that said, don't trust what the ISO New England people are about to say, right? Seems like a pretty good way to start the summit off on the right foot. So that was a goal. We wanted to do an op-ed in a Massachusetts newspaper and a Connecticut newspaper, and then we wanted to do social media to amplify the content and make sure that people were seeing it that way. And we built, I know I say coalition members here, but we built a toolkit where the different organizations could pull from the content. And then we were on the front page of the Burlington Free Press, delivered to the hotel rooms on the morning of the summit. Thank you. I appreciate everyone clapping, but it was, first of all, Mireille delivered the goods big time. She was in a bunch of these other stories. All of these stories came from the virtual media briefing that we did, and this one was the morning of. The other ones were integrated into what ISO New England said at the summit. There was an immediate counter that was already on the record with the journalists who were covering it, so that the coverage was really balanced. It wasn't just them trying to get a response after the fact. But this story, we believe, led to a setting in which the commissioners maybe had some slightly different questions when they were talking to it wasn't perfect, right? But we got to change the narrative a little bit by being really specific on who our audience was and being really specific on the vehicle we could use to deliver our message to that audience. Now, I realize that not everybody is in a position to be doing virtual media briefings with lots of journalists, but this is just sort of like a fun example of how anybody can build a plan like this, right? Yeah.
Is this an example of where you have an ostensible audience which might not be the actual target?
Yeah, so unpack that a little bit for everybody.
So for an op-ed in a newspaper, the audience might seem to be the public
Yes.
at large.
Yes.
But your real target is you want some of the insiders to see that and get the message.
I love it, yes. Right, and this is, I think, this is an important point about how to use media in general, which is, I think that sometimes when we engage with media, our default is to say to ourselves, the audience is whoever reads the newspaper, right? But we get to repackage content however we want, and we also can speak to the audience we want to speak to through the media opportunity, right? And so yes, there were probably tons of people from the city of Burlington, Vermont, who read this article when they woke up and had their coffee that morning, and maybe it was the first time they'd really thought about these issues, and that's great. That is sort of, I see it as a second-tier benefit of doing this, as we maybe got some new people to pay attention to it. But yeah, we were talking to the Burlington Free Press, but we were really talking to the FERC commissioners when they come out of their rooms in the morning to come to the summit. It's a really important point. I also would put a finer point on it, which is we did some paid LinkedIn posts with a little bit of funding that I had, and the funding targeted we posted one of these pieces. I think it was maybe the NHPR piece or this Boston Business Journal Viewpoint piece. We actually targeted the ad and LinkedIn is amazing. You can target at people's titles on LinkedIn. So we went for the ISO New England board members. We went for people who identified as working with the utilities. We went as people identified on LinkedIn as working with FERC. So we could actually target this exact piece directly to. Now, we didn't have very much money for it, so I don't know how far it actually went, but that was where our heads were, is how do we deliver this content to them? So we've got about 15 minutes left, which is perfect. I thought it would be kind of fun to hear from you. How are you talking about some of the issues that you're wrestling with? Like, how do you talk about the problem? How do you talk about the solution currently? Where are you struggling? And maybe we can, have a little fun talking through some of those issues. So let's start with the problem, maybe. Put yourselves into that stakeholder persuasion setting where you're trying to convince that person you really need to convince about the issues that you're invested in. How do you talk about the problem? Anybody want to give me an example of how you do it? Go for it, and tell me your name when you do.
My name is Don.
Hi, Don.
I am New Hampshire's consumer advocate. I have 2 titles in the state agency that I run. A, I'm the boss, and B, I'm the minister of propaganda.
All right, fantastic.
So here's my problem. The owners of the electricity grid are sucking free money out of the wallets of the people whose interests I represent. And I'm mad.
And you're mad about it. I felt the emotion in that. I love it. And let me ask you, can I ask you a question? So I want to interrogate the stories and data points. Do you have a number or a statistic that you always talk about when you're doing this, or a group of statistics?
The fact that New Englanders pay the highest transmission rates in the country.
Boom, right there. That is a credibility building data point, right? I mean, it's also pushes people towards an emotion of maybe being outraged that they're in that category, but we're talking about, and that's based on an analysis by whom?
The Energy Information Administration.
Amazing. So oftentimes, I like to actually put the citation when I'm putting it in my message, right? We are paying more than anybody else according to credible source, right? Now, by the way, I'm going to make a carve out here, which is we are operating in the most challenging environment ever to be doing persuasive communications on fact-based material, right? Because if you are of no interest in being fact-based, it is an amazing time to be a persuasive communicator because you can just fire anything out of the cannon and see what happens. But we are people of integrity who are trying to do this the right way, and we are not operating in a vacuum where people will just take our information and not hear anything else. We're competing against disinfo and misinfo by the players who have an agenda in promoting that. We won't have time today to go into how to combat disinfo. I do a whole training on disinfo and misinfo, so stay tuned, maybe some other time. But I do want to acknowledge that the environment is challenging, but still, do you have any stories you use on that problem? Like, do you ever tell people, let me tell you about this specific?
Yeah, let me tell you about the $100 million that Eversource wants to spend rebuilding 500 transmission poles because about 30 of them have some termite damage. They are hoping nobody is going to notice that. I have noticed, and so have my
I love it. I love it. So what I love about that is I now have an image in my head of transmission poles. I think I know what those look like. And And I'm thinking termites, I'm thinking small holes in the like what's, right? So like, it's not abstract anymore. And you also threw in some more data points. You gave me some numbers. So I love it. Anybody, someone else want to do their problem? How do you talk about the problem? Anyone want to take a swing? Yes, and introduce yourself.
I'm Lily.
Hi, Lily.
So I used to work in the solar industry, and that was my first introduction to ISO New England. And the way that I was introduced to it was all of my buddies on the deployment side of things were like, oh my gosh, ISO New England, we can't get through this interconnection study. And so when I'm talking about fix the grid, it becomes, we can't connect things to the grid because ISO is slowing us down so much.
Yep.
And a story or a note that I put in that is, I was only at this company for 3 years, and in that time, it used to take 2.5 years from permitting or from the start to being able to turn on the project. Now it takes 5 or 6 years because of the ISO connection process took so long.
Love that. So that story is a great, that's like a nice merger, right? Because I hear in that, I'm getting some emotion, because that's like pure frustration, like what the heck are we doing? But then I'm also hearing, oh, you worked at a solar company where you experienced this like firsthand, and you're able to give me some concrete validation that this is getting worse, right? Or has gotten worse. I really like it. Anyone else? Talk about how you talk about the problem you're trying to solve. Please?
Story that I heard relating to solar was by somebody I know who had a client who wanted to put solar on their farm, and for various reasons got blocked by the state. And then the developer bought that land and put condos on it because the town allowed the zoning. And for me, that was a horrible story. I could go on from there, but that would be a solution about cutting out, allowing dual source development of
Yep.
agricultural land as a solution.
Yep. Yeah, so yeah, now we're moving into the solution piece, which is like, in some ways, as I said, the trajectory we want to follow here is I need to be so strong in how I articulate the problem that you're with me by the time I get to solution, or you're at least open to what I have to say, right? I want to convince you and persuade you enough that we have a problem so that you're invested in what the solution is. And if I don't do a good enough job on the problem part, I'm trying to convince you of a solution that you may not be sure we really need or that you ought to really care about, right? And so that's why I like to do, like the problem part tends to be where we have more emotion and a little bit less of, we might use those, emotion and credibility fairly equally. It tends to be when we get to the solution part, we're getting a little bit more into the weeds, which is okay. But if you can find a story that shows the solution, right? Show, don't tell. Anybody have a story they use on the solution side? Maybe a community you point to that say, look how they did it here, or how they're doing it here. Success stories, things like that. What stories do you all use when you're talking about the solution? And introduce yourself.
I put solar on my roof, and for 4 months a year, I have no utility bill.
Beautiful, right? So now I'm feeling the emotion of jealousy, right? And I'm also getting the credibility of what your bill looks like. By the way, showing people that type of granular level, right? Which is not, like you could make if you were to say that exact same statement, that if you put solar on your roof, you won't have to pay a bill for 4 months out of the year, that's good. But when you say, when I open my electric bill for 4 months out of the year, it's my favorite part of the day is when my electric bill comes in there. The favorite part of the month is when the bill comes and I open it up, and because of my solar panels, it's zero, right? Like, that's different. Now it's an emotional thing, and I can visualize and I can see you opening your mail, excitedly and dancing around your kitchen being like, no bill this month, right? I'm being a little dramatic, but yes, I like it. Solutions. How else do anybody use some stories to do their solution telling? And introduce yourself.
Pastor Orland, I leased a Chevy Volt in 2017 for $200 a month with
no money down thanks to the More EV program in Mass that rebated each deposit.
Beautiful.
I pay less per month. More Dash EV, the state energy department program to subsidize electric vehicles. They give a $3,500 incentive payment today. Then it was $2,500, and so all I needed to put down to get the lease was the $2,500. I hooked it up to my solar panels on my roof. I drove on sunshine.
Love it. Right. And again, it's your version, right? It's also much harder to say to somebody that's not true if it's your story and not an abstract talking point. Anyone else want to throw out a solution that you tell us that's got a good story about? All right. I'll let you off the hook. Now, how about a call to action? Anybody have a really strong call to action that's really clear that you are really good at delivering? Somebody hit me with a call to action. Who's got one? Mira, you got one. Give me a call to action. What was your most recent call to action?
About an hour ago, we told people to email their state officials and ask them to be champions for governance reform.
Beautiful, right? A big part of this call to action piece is to give ourselves the reward of, if we've done our work, we've been so thoughtful and we've worked so hard to convince somebody of the problem, to get them invested in the solution, your gift to yourself is to ask them to do something with that information, right? Have them take something with them. And so this is the fun part, right? This is where you get to say, you're fired up, I love it, you're excited as I am. Here's what you actually need to do. Even with some of the most professional organizations I work with on a regular basis, if I had to say what the single most common thing missing from their messaging is a really clear call to action. This is what I expect you to do with that information. Great way to optimize communications right away is to ask yourself at the end of, or as you're preparing any communications, do I have a call to action? And is the call to action clear, right? Will people understand it? Could they say it back to me at the end? This is what you're asking me to do, right? That's a good way to test. If they say, well, I'm not sure, you want me to call this person, but you also want me to tweet this thing, and then you want me to show up at this event, and I don't know which one's more important to you, that's a pretty complicated call to action. Simplify it, right? The thing that I need you to do, based on who our audiences are that we have to reach with this message, is I need you to show up at this, right? Or I need you to pick up the phone and call this person, right? So we are just about at time. I wanted to stop and see if there's any questions on any of this. I hope it was helpful. I realize that was a lot in a very short time period. And I'm also, it's always tough being like the last person on the speaking program because everyone's been talking all day long and living off of Oreos and potato chips. But are there any other questions or things that you're struggling with that I can help with? Yes?
How do you encourage people to evaluate the efficacy of a messaging campaign for organizations that do this over and over for different campaigns? How can we learn from a campaign we've done and say, this worked well, we need to improve this?
I love this question. Okay, so when I am building a communication plan, I didn't put it in this session because I didn't have time to go through all of it, but we talked about, actually, John, can you back up to the case study? So if you back up to the first one, so we did audience, right? When we're building a comms plan, we're saying who our audience is. The next one, we're building out our messaging. Then we're doing our vehicle assessment. There's two more things that I put in every communication plan that I put together. And actually, if you find the original communication plan I did for this event, it has these, so I'm not making this up. There's a section that I put called tactics, which is literally, here's the things that we're gonna do. That's the vehicle assessment. But then we're gonna do cadence of what the time frame is to actually execute. And within that, we're also gonna say, at what point do we evaluate whether it's working, right? There needs to be some time frame where we look back and say, we're not just gonna do this forever. We tried this tactic 3 weeks after the FERC meeting, we're gonna decide whether it worked, right? So we're going to put a guardrail on when we look and hold ourselves accountable to it. And then I also always put a section on staffing so that I can hold myself accountable to, do we actually have people who can do the things I'm saying we need to do, right? Who's going to actually reach out to the journalists? Who's going to build the social media toolkit? Who's going to be responsible for that? So then it's not just here's the tactics, but here's who's responsible for doing it. And then when we get to that moment, a couple months out, a couple weeks out, where we want to evaluate, we have to decide whether we want to evaluate a strategy quarterly, evaluate it on a weekly basis, et cetera. When we get to that evaluation point, I can now look back and say, did we do all the tactics we said we were going to do? Did they work? And were they in the right sequence? Did all of this happen the way we charted it out? And if it did it work? If it didn't happen at all, then we have a different problem, which is, why couldn't we execute? How do we fix that for the next time? But I think that's a really important part of it. Yes?
I just have to ask, when you evaluated the outcome of this campaign, was it effective? And how did you determine if so?
Yeah, well, so if you go back to we got the press, right? So that was good. We knew we got the coverage, and we definitely broke into the narrative. I would say, if you were to go to the first one, the objective, for our very specific objective, which was to use this summit as a means to get our message out, yes, I think we were effective. Now, I didn't necessarily, and to apply pressure, yeah, we did apply some pressure because we had reporters and commissioners asking hard questions that they probably wouldn't have been asked otherwise in a public setting. If my objective was something as ambitious as ISO New England is going to completely do a 180 and do everything differently, no, but that also, I don't put those as objectives, right? My best advice I can give on objectives is to both keep yourself motivated, but also to make sure you're really accomplishing things along the way that build momentum. I have an obsessive strategy I use on how do I choose objectives, and it boils down to this. It's a great thing to end on. I try to do things on the communications front that are both big enough to matter, but small enough to solve, right? If I pick an objective that is so massive that I'll never be able to know whether we actually did the thing we said, all I'm gonna do is lead myself to heartbreak, right? And so I try to do things that I know I can execute on because we have the bandwidth to do it, but it also matters, right? I'm not gonna do something so minute that it's like, I'm gonna accomplish it and be like, oh, big deal, right? And so we try to find that sweet spot. It's a great thing to bring back to your teams or people you're working with. Big enough to matter, small enough to solve. Organizationally, it's a great way to build momentum. I've been working on something with John on third-party electric suppliers, and every single thing we've broken off in that fight has been big enough to matter, small enough to solve, and it sustains momentum over time. It really does help. Yeah, and then I think we're good.
As far as if the call to action is like to your audience, so it's multiple people.
Yep.
As against one decision maker or two. You're talking to your audience and it's a call to action on them.
Yep.
How do you figure out whether the call to action got heeded or not?
So I think this is, it really depends a little bit on the call to action, but we want to, the question you asked, I think we can also do some tracking and accountability around whether people are doing the call to action that we ask them to do, right? And so, like for example, if our call to action is use your social media to share this content, we should be able to go back and see, did people share the content we asked them to? If the ask is, the call to action is we want you to call this policymaker, I would usually work into that ask, call the policymaker, and then report back to us how it went. Tell us what it was like. Did you hear anything interesting? Did they say anything? Did they write back to you, right? Little things that allow us to say, okay, they actually did the things that they said they were gonna do. I also we're not doing this to be mean to people, to be like, you didn't do what our call to action was. It's more to see in the evaluation stage, was that the right call to action? Did we pick a call to action that was so complicated that it scared people off? Or did we give them something they could actually do? And obviously, if a call to action is show up at this event that we're having next week, you get to look at the room and see if you actually, did it right. So I think there's ways to build some tracking and accountability in that way too. But I know we're at time, so I will give the floor back to Mary. But thank you all, this was really fun. Hope it was helpful.